So just a couple of things before I get started. I was sitting out there thinking, a couple of great questions to think about during the day is what's the role of the veterinarian in the future? All right, so where do you want to be as a profession? And then second of all the things we've been talking about are sort of what we would call marginal changes. But consider that you had nothing currently, and what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail, right? So what would it look like? How would you start to build a profession if you didn't already have the current structure? So when I talk about structural change, that's what I'm talking about, is you have a certain structure in place to get applicants to become veterinarians. How do we change that structure to produce a veterinarian in the future that has a role that you all have envisioned? Right? So that's the thing. And guess what I get to be as the scorekeeper, right? So as you see, I'm going to keep this score, and every year I'm going to produce this KPI, a key performance indicator for the profession, that's called the debt-to-income ratio, right? And the really important thing about that debt-to-income ratio is it kind of combines society's willingness and ability to pay for veterinary services and the cost of producing that veterinarian and those veterinary services, all right? So it's out of alignment, and we need to get into alignment. And how do we do that? So I'm going to put some context to that. I don't want you to think of these as rules, but I just wanted to give you some context on how you go about doing that. So I just wanted to give you sort of an idea of where we are. This came from the 2015 graduates from the 28 U.S. colleges. And so the total amount of debt was estimated at about $427,000.
So we just want to make sure everybody hears you, Mike.
Everybody good? Let me pick that up.
Look down there.
About $42 million. Starting salary would have been about $214 million. Now remember that we're imputing that because we only have about 40% of the students getting full-time jobs before graduation where the data comes from. So we don't actually know what the starting salary is when they start after they've done internships and other things. That gives us a debt-to-income ratio for 2015 of 1.99 to 1. All right, so that's where we're at. And basically, it's essentially 2 to 1. This is an index, this debt-to-income ratio. It wasn't meant for the students to tell them what the situation was going forward. It's an index. It's a marker. It's a scorecard for us to figure out, are we making progress in reducing that debt-to-income ratio? So it considers a constant cohort of graduates. That means every year we adjust everybody so that they have the same number going to the different regions of the U.S., having the same practice types and gender. All right. Only the graduates with full-time employment prior to graduation are used. And again, it's not a simple ratio of taking the mean debt divided by the mean income. It's the income or debt divided by income for each individual and the mean of that. Okay, so it's a little bit more difficult to compute, and that's done on a constant cohort. So it is an index. Okay, so here we are. I pointed out four major goal areas to take a look at, and I divided up as an economist would by who are all the parties in the game. So the first party is the students, and based on our calculations and what we've gotten from the students on the senior survey and from the colleges on what it costs, taking the cost of education, the tuition, living expenses, and interest on those loans that they're taking during school, there's about a $9 million difference between what the debt is and what the actual cost is. And so we feel like we can get that down. We can get rid of that. That would bring the debt-to-income ratio from 1.99 to 1.95. Now, it's not a lot, but it is something, and it's something we can do with the students. So that would be the students' contribution. The next contribution would be from the government or from the general public, and that's trying to eliminate those interest payments while they're in school. That used to be the case. It no longer is. We'd like to get that back. That would be $22 million worth of savings. That would bring the debt-to-income ratio from 1.99 down to 1.89. So a fairly substantial reduction in the debt-to-income ratio. Next, one that's been real popular, we can grow starting salaries by 10%. And I didn't mean when I say that we should just pay people more. We should make people earn more, right? That would be a $22 million increase in income, and that would drop the debt-to-income ratio from 1.99 to 1.81. And finally, we could give the schools a big hit and tell them we're going to cut your budgets by $43 million, or we can have you go out and raise an endowment of about $1.5 billion, which would fund that. And by the time they raise that money, we could start again because the debt would have already climbed that much again. So a $43 million cut, that would reduce the debt to income down to 1.79. And if you did all four of those goals, we could get down to 1.38. Okay? So there's the four parties that are involved. There's the hits that I gave them. You don't have to do that, but we are going to have some accounting and some accountability from each one of the groups. Everybody's going to have to be involved in the profession in order to reach that goal. It's not going to be one single entity. As you look at this, there is no way, when you add all that up, that $96 million, there's no way that any one of those groups can come up with $96 million. And, unfortunately, that assumes a lot of great assumptions.
Can you say why 1.38 is important?
Sure. So we looked at 1.4 as being, a lot of financial people will tell you that it should be 1-to-1, right? In order to finance that. But that's based on a bachelor's degree and not a professional degree. Because a professional degree, the income on a professional degree raises faster than it would under a normal situation for someone with a bachelor's degree, they can afford a little bit higher debt. Now, obviously, we'd love to have it be 1-to-1 or less, but 1.38 is a rate really, or 1.4-to-1 would be a really good target. Again, so these are the economic assumptions that we used to come up with that. A continued GDP growth rate of 2.1%. That means that we'd continue to have an increase in demand for veterinary services and increased salaries. No growth in the seats at veterinary colleges and no new COE accredited veterinary colleges. So we'd have no adverse impact on salaries. And then finally, we did have in there an increased cost of education of 3% per year. And you saw last night Dean Baker gave us his schedule that showed a 4%, a 2% increase, and you saw what that did in terms of real dollars. So that has a fairly big impact. The other set of assumptions there, as you see, what happens to the applicants and the seats, and of course that goes into our estimates as well. So here's what it would look like just based on where we are today and based on those set of assumptions. In terms of the red line there would be the real weighted debt over the time, raising at 3% per year. The green line would be the income and what's happening to income, where we're projecting that to go over the next 10 years to 2025. And that would give you a debt-to-income ratio that's going to hover slightly around 2 and above 2 throughout that next 10-year period. So that's under those economic assumptions I just gave you. If in 2015 you'd have implemented, and again, if you'd have implemented all four of those goals in 2015, that red dot is where costs would have been. The green dot is where income would have been, and we'd have had that 1.38 debt-to-income ratio. But we didn't do that in 2015. In fact, we're not going to do that in 2016. And during that same time, cost is going to continue to go up. All right? What's the forecast look like? Well, if we put all those goals in place, right, we can drop down to just under 1.6. Remember that we're talking about implementing all four of those goals at a 5-year period. And then the costs will start taking hold again because those things now are in there and the costs start rising. And so we'll never actually get to that 1.38. We'll get to 1.62. So you have 5 years that debt-to-income ratio is going to drop. And in those 5 years, you need to come up with those structural changes. And you need to start implementing them in year 5 so you can continue having that drop. Or we're going to come back to you and say, well, we had a 10%, we asked you for a 10% increase in income and you gave it to us. Now we need a 20% increase. Okay? Well, unfortunately, we're likely to have a recession within the next year, year and a half, maybe 2 years at the most. And in fact, we're likely to have 2 recessions in the next 10 years. Right? We're also likely to see an increase in the number of seats. and potentially new schools come on board. And if all those events happen, you'll never reach 1.62, you'll reach 1.72, and even more importantly, there'll be periods where you feel like you're going backwards, right? So you should understand that from the get-go, that there are going to be periods where no matter what we do and how hard we try, we might not have the impact that's desired. But we will long term, and that's what you should keep in mind. Okay, so in summary, our target's going to be 1.4 to 1. That's a great target. I think it's something that we can get to, but everybody's going to have to be on board. I put 4 goals phased in over the next 5 years. Okay, so we can put them in a little bit at a time and finally get to that total that I showed you within a 5-year period. Those 4 goals would have reduced the debt-to-income ratio to 1.38 to 1 in 2015, but it may reduce it to 1.62 to 1 by 2025, unless we have some of those adverse economic situations, in which case we might be able to get to 1.72 to 1 by 2023. Okay, and finally, structural changes will be needed in 2020 to further reduce the debt-to-income ratio from 1.4 to 1 by 2025. So that's what we're looking at. Again, we need to have some accountability. We need to figure out what the solutions are, but how much are those solutions going to impact that debt-to-income ratio, right? And again, unfortunately or not for you, I get to be the scorekeeper. Thank you.
Gentlemen, right in the suit, nice-looking suit there. Yes, sir. Yeah, good to see. No, this gentleman in the third.
Would you further clarify the economic assumptions being made, and where I'm going with this is, there are not many projections of a robust middle class in this country. In fact, there's more information suggesting the opposite. In the world that I live in, quite a bit, people who cannot afford this practice model that this profession has built, cash only, increasing fees. So what assumptions along those lines have you built into the budget?
That's a really great question. I talk about that all the time. So keep in mind that we do have this sort of declining middle class, or we've had a continuous decline in the average per capita consumption by household. So when that happens, that is going to reduce the demand for veterinary services, and that has been happening, and that's what happened during the recession that caused such a problem. In the models we have, we are modeling what the effect of GDP growth is on that purchasing decision and how that affects the demand for veterinary services. So that's in there. The point of that increasing or putting 10% increase on the income of veterinarians is in fact that very thing. Is how do we now capture? How do we change the business model so we capture some of that need that is not now demand? That's a really important component. So that's, I think, the focus that I think should be on the practice owners and the employers, is how do we capture that? IDEX says $17,700 for a canine for a lifetime value of veterinary services, and we're providing $4,500 of it. How do we capture that difference?
Okay, another question. I'm gonna just look around the room that we not heard from. A gentleman right at the back. Yes, sir. I think I saw a hand go up there. Yes, sir.
Mike?
Stand up.
Yes. Mike, the change from, the change from 2.0 to 1.72, how much stress reduction would the profession experience, do you think, in that change?
I think the best number I heard this morning, I think it was Matt that said, your study said for every $100,000 of debt was a 1% increase in the depression, right? I think that's we don't have a measure yet for how much financial stress and how much of that's causing mental problems or anything, but obviously that is going to have an impact on the profession, that income. So I really can't answer that. Sorry.
Okay, one final comment from this young lady here. Yes, ma'am. No, I know my eyes get crossed, so yes, ma'am. For clarification, please.
Hi. I was just wondering if you happen to have any data on the increase in the total cost of education per student relative to inflation, obviously, over the years. I mean, I know that tuition has increased exponentially, but we've been talking about the portion that's paid by the state versus privately. I was just wondering, for the total cost of education, no matter who it's paid for, how much that's increased over the past, say, 30 or 50 years relative to inflation, if you knew that.
10-second answer, please.
Do I get the tape?
10 seconds.
That data is